So everyone's in. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to or welcome back to IDRC, as the case might be for you. My name is Rohinton Medora. I'm the Vice President for Programs here at IDRC. And it is my pleasure to welcome all of you and Doug Saunders to a discussion of and around his book, Arrival City, The Final Migration and Our Next World. We will have a discussion both in person and on the web, so welcome also to those of you watching on the web. In his book, Doug Saunders captures a phenomenon, and it's a phenomenon that we all see around us almost all the time. It's a phenomenon that we have witnessed throughout history, and it's a very sort of basic human impulse, which is to move from villages and farmland to cities to make a better life for oneself and one's children. That's at the core what this book is about. It's about people moving within countries and across countries, and in so doing, creating a set of issues that perhaps we haven't fully sort of grappled with, particularly because this is, as he says in the subtitle to his book, The Final Migration and Our Next World. At some point, the phenomenon will end. Until it does, it remains a major aspect of public policy and, in fact, private behavior. And there are elements of which sometimes, somewhere we've got it right, and in other times we haven't. And so the book is a series of vignettes of people who have made the move across the world. And at the end of the book, and in fact, implicit throughout the book and its argument, are various lessons on how we might do things better and what things to avoid and what things to do right. The book is a phenomenon in another sense, which is that this is can be and often is an awfully turgid subject, both personally and from a policy and analytical point of view. And Doug Saunders has brought his professional eye as a journalist, observer, and columnist to his writing, and so the book is especially accessible. That is something that readers of the book note instantly, and that reviewers have also made a point of noting, which is the connection between the ease of exposition and the depth of the analysis within it. Therefore, not surprisingly, Doug is an award-winning journalist, having won 4 newspaper awards, the highest Canadian newspaper awards here. His column has also been award-winning. He currently heads the European Bureau for the Globe and Mail and has a weekly column in that newspaper. The book has been shortlisted for the Lionel Gelber Prize, which will be announced in March, and so all the best for that as well, Doug. The way this will work is Doug will make a few opening remarks. We will then have a short conversation, Oprah style, as it were, across the couches, and leave enough time, I hope, at least half an hour to 45 minutes at the end, for all of you to ask questions and have questions come in from our viewers on the web as well. The usual, I hope, ground rules apply. Please keep your questions brief and identify yourself. And I very much look forward to the afternoon with you. So, Doug, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Rohinton, and thank you, everyone at IDRC, for allowing a stranger into the development cave for a few moments. And this is a book that, in part, was inspired by my observing a lot of the work coming out of the development community that was interesting and perhaps scattered over a lot of places and self-contradictory in some cases and so on, but also out of my own personal travels and work. I'd come to notice patterns and wanted to explore them, so I made it a 3-year project to visit about 20 of these arrival cities, as I'm calling them, and their connected villages on 5 continents, and look at people's stories, look at the ideas behind them, and some of the economics behind them, and so on. Look, to understand what I mean by arrival cities, I think I should start just by describing one such place and one such person in it, and because I think the story of a person's trajectory through these places might help understand how it works. Let's go into Dhaka, Bangladesh, which by many measures is the fastest growing city in the world, certainly in the top 3. There, right near the center, right near Gulshan, which is the very wealthy neighborhood where most of the middle class people live in high rises, you'll find a place called Korail, or Korail, usually pronounced, made up of a dense warren of tin shacks on a swampy peninsula that, as recently as 1990, was more or less empty municipal land. It remains municipal land, but now a place that you'd think could house a few hundred people if some of the land was drained and reclaimed now holds 25,000 people in an impossibly tight density. It was with some real trepidation that I entered this particular neighborhood because it looked really forbidding. First you had to cross a lake of sewage, essentially, standing several people shoulder to shoulder in a hand-rowed boat for which you had to pay somebody to get off on a garbage-strewn shore and enter the narrowest of laneways between mud-floored shacks that were maybe the largest were about 8 feet by 10 feet. Certainly a level of poverty that you'd see in the worst Asian slums: no toilets, running water jury-rigged in by a system of garden hoses at great expense to the people who paid the gangs for the water that came through it. No form of school or childcare or anything, so children running wild in the video arcades that had been jury-rigged in there as well. But cable TV everywhere. The cable TV installer was the guy who got me in there and who often is the great figure in the slums of, certainly of most of Indian subcontinent and South America nowadays, and is a good indication of the aspirational nature of these places. It was a place that smells bad, vulnerable to floods, not a desirable place by any stretch. But during the week I spent in its laneways talking to people and, most importantly, going through their household budgets, I found a recurrent set of patterns that I found in similar transitional informal neighborhoods in slums in China, the Indian subcontinent, the Middle East, Africa, and South America, almost identical. And a typical guy would be a guy named Ujjwal Mia, who's a 21-year-old guy I met. He had come about a year and a bit before from a very poor, starvation-prone village in the Ganges Delta. He'd spent his teens coming to Dhaka seasonally during the growing season to do low-level work, selling fruit on the streets and so on, to gain a little bit of extra money to send back to his village to support and supplement their rice paddy income and basically keep people from starving, because there was a seasonal starvation that tended to kill people there. And then the year before, his village had decided that he and his father should move there, and his extended family had decided that this would be an investment to get them out of the seasonal starvation. So he started out in a slum that looked, to my eyes, to be more desirable. It was one of the bamboo ones by the river, which seemed larger and more airy. But he had actually saved to get himself a place in Korail for a couple reasons that you have to understand if you see these places. First of all, because it's a neighborhood next to these high-rise apartments, so there was work for people, both doing the things that people hire people for in wealthy neighborhoods as house cleaners, childcare, prostitution, and so on, selling goods that you may have to the people who live there, and also factory work, good entrepreneurial opportunities and so on, but most importantly, a sense that you could get a title deed, not a legal one at all, because it wasn't legal land, but from somebody who you were buying your tin shack from, and have a sustainable form of ownership that you could then leverage into loans that you could use to start a small business and so on. In the slums of people who make a couple dollars a day, you do see a lot of the form of property speculation that you see among the middle class in Canada and so on, and for good reasons. And in part of the reasons why the dynamics of these places seem strange is because people at the very lowest incomes are speculating on future property values. He found himself work after some fabric garment working jobs, found himself work in an office building, bundling and installing Ethernet cables, which paid him $75 a month, which is more than his neighbors in the garment factories. His rent was $25 a month for 2 rooms, which he shared with his father. So much more than half of his earnings went back to the village, where this money paid for a tile floor for their formerly mud-floored house, school for his sisters, a shift by the family from paddy farming to some cash crop fruit as well, and so on, to earn a cash income, get out of subsistence. And then eventually a decision that the family would take the next lump of money that came along, sell their holdings there to a neighboring farmer who was wanting to become more commercial and expand his paddy farming, and move entirely into the slum community with hopes of saving enough to move out and get the neighbors into this type of cable laying business, with hopes of, it exposes the family to IT businesses that were a little more advanced than the laying cables. Now, that's an example of things working for somebody who moves into a slum from a village. And this type of pattern is certainly the ambition of everyone who moves into a marginal community, whether it's in the developing world or in somewhere like Canada. The expectation is that you are going to take a huge risk and a huge investment on behalf of yourself and probably your family and large parts of your village, but that there is a better than even chance of you having an experience like his. Now, certainly within this neighborhood, which has no form of government investment or even policing or anything, and various dodgy gangs run a lot of the things, about half the people who moved in would end up moving back, which I think is a universal around the world. It's a gamble, and about half of people don't make it. And a good proportion of people would get stuck in very bad situations where, for example, their husband would die and they'd had to put their only child in what was essentially an orphanage or so on, or they'd have to fall into very humiliating forms of work, such as prostitution, that they hadn't expected, and so on. So certainly the social and human risks without any government support are huge. But the supports going back, the arrival city essentially has legs going in 2 directions. It has legs going back to the originating village in forms of support of money, support for future migrations into the city, and support for development there. And then it has another leg going into what I'd call the core city, into the established economy of the city, in terms of hoping to send your children into education at various levels there, hoping to attract consumers from there to whatever little shops you're able to open. And this slum had huge numbers of shops and garment factories and so on, run by the slum dwellers and so on, as do a great many in Asia. At the center of this dynamic is what the economist Deepa Narayan from the World Bank describes as the rural poor today in the developing world thriving when they do by building joint portfolios, as she says, of farming, business, and migration remittances to hedge economic risk across several platforms. And if that sounds like a business pages type language applied to people who are marginal peasants and slum dwellers, yes, though they wouldn't use exactly those words, but certainly that set of concepts of building a joint portfolio to hedge risk is not at all unknown to people in villages and slums of the developing world, possibly more acutely known and understood than it is to Bay Street bankers. And at the center of this dynamic is this place I'm calling the arrival city. And I'm looking at ways that this can become a place that guys like this can become the norm rather than the exception. Certainly, as I said, the expectation is that they will be. So the people at UN Habitat popularized the phrase describing these places not as slums of despair, but rather slums of hope. And it's not a bad phrase to describe this. Now, why have I created the name arrival cities when there's a huge range of names in the literature to describe these sort of neighborhoods? Partly because all of them see these places as static appendages on the city, as places that are simply insalubrious neighborhoods occupied by the poor who happen to be there without a role. I'm trying to instead draw attention to their dynamic nature, to make it apparent that the transitional urban neighborhood is, throughout the southern and eastern quadrants of the world, the key instrument of rural development as well. When we look at arrival cities, we tend to see them as these fixed entities. Their residents are seen, as Enrique Cardoso said before he became the Brazilian president, as an ecologically defined group rather than as part of the social system. And we need to start understanding them that way. We tend to treat the village as well, often as an isolated and static place, as a subsistence level, agricultural life, as if that were its only fate. One of the dangers in aid language today is to treat the village and the urban slum both as if they were separate and competing targets for development. With the concept, things like the Millennium Villages project will occasionally add on after a long focus on strictly improving subsistence agriculture to become mere subsistence agriculture. Will add on this concept of rural-urban linkages as an afterthought, but not as a core aspect to the program. We have to realize that these non-urban linked villages that are targets of aid in many cases, certainly they exist. There are villages that are so marginal that there's no chance of having any migration linked to the city. This is the case in many parts of sub-Saharan Africa, although many fewer than you'd think. And I made a study in the book of a place like that in eastern Maharashtra, in Vidarbha area, right around the center of India, where I would argue that the lack of migration links to a city, which I would argue was more political and social than physical, was impeding rural development to a deadly degree. But we need to, instead of asking how we can upgrade these places to be merely subsistence, we need to start asking how we can create these links and encourage them, and so on. The shift from subsistence agriculture to a more urban-focused economy, including an urban-driven agricultural economy, is the defining event of this century, and it will catch up on these places eventually, ideally in a managed way that makes life better for people and not in a cataclysmic way. The arrival city is the main source of rural development in a great many poor countries in the world today. 6 years ago, China passed a threshold where the money coming from the 200 million peasants working in arrival city informal neighborhoods and dormitories in the coastal cities became the largest source of rural income. So there is now more money coming into the countryside of China now, sent from relatives in the cities, than all of the income from all agriculture in China combined. The Chinese village is an urbanized place. It is developed by the city rather than vice versa. And China's not unique in this. This is true in Bangladesh, Morocco, Brazil, and Poland, from what I've seen, that the village is supported by the city, not vice versa. The Polish peasant village in Poland is the last substantial country of peasant farmers in the EU 27 countries, Romania maybe as well. If you go through household budgets there, you'll find that the money sent by the oldest daughter who's cleaning toilets in the London office tower is a larger source of income than all of the food revenue, all of the EU subsidies and Polish government subsidies combined, and so on. And you suddenly recognize the importance of that migration in developing things. It's the arrival city, whether it's a slum or a high-rise enclave in the Western world, that will finance the shift out of subsistence smallhold farming into a type of labor-intensive, cash-driven farming that could be an important part in solving the current food shortages that we're seeing around the world. And I'm not saying that everybody's going to move out of the farm and urbanize. It tends to be a mixture of shifts from subsistence farming to rural non-farm incomes, an upgrading of the farming, some expansion of land, and a move to the city, and so on. The growth of the great cities of the developing world now is not largely caused by people moving from the village to the city. About 2/3 of it is caused simply by growth within the city, and of the remaining third, about half of that is caused by the city encroaching on old villages and so on. I'd like people to understand the arrival city, even if it is an unhygienic, mud-floored slum, as a place where residents intend it to succeed because they have, all of them, made a huge investment in its success and taken an enormous personal and family risk, which is a bet on the neighborhood's ability to function as a social mobility instrument. When things go wrong, and they very often go wrong, I think we journalists are used to going into marginal neighborhoods that have gone wrong, or going into ones that haven't and making the only question we ask, what's wrong? It's because governments tend to place impediments in the way of an arrival city's natural inclination to success. These impediments can be physical and infrastructural, blocking the links to markets of the city or to the opening of businesses and so on, or simply bulldozing them, which was the history that fortunately is dying away in some places now, but it's still done in India, some African countries, and so on. There are bureaucratic and legal impediments. And in fact, here we have a lesson that some conservative governments can listen to on this, and that very often the way to make migrant neighborhoods succeed is to get government out of the way and so on, and to allow people to open businesses within their houses to increase the density and so on. And very large impediments in terms of preventing real or de facto citizenship from immediately becoming available to people who are living there, which in a very short period of time can prevent people from investing in their communities, sending their children to university, setting up small businesses and so on, and very quickly turn a socially mobile community into an underclass community that has no relationship to society. And both barriers to pathways to legal citizen and to de facto citizenship within cities often are the biggest factors in criminalizing these places, turning them into threats to a country rather than development things. The difference between a successful arrival city neighborhood and one whose ambitions are blocked or allowed to fail can be huge. Brazil and Turkey were both countries that developed huge informal communities around their urban periphery in the 50s to 1970s, favelas in Brazil, Getchikondu in Turkey. For years, governments tried to stop these settlements, and the results were misery after neighborhoods were destroyed and generations of investments were wiped away, and then terrible violence and fighting in the outskirts. Both countries responded with military dictatorships that were, to a large extent, aimed at quelling the unrest in the arrival city. And then afterwards, after this had all stabilized and so on, during the last decade, both Brazil and Turkey have been governed by a new middle class that has developed out of the arrival city by individuals, particularly during the last decade, who, in both countries, who came from the arrival city. And as a consequence of this, both these places have experienced a decade of democratic stability, growing trade and economies and so on. So we can see how a properly managed or not mismanaged arrival city can be a tool for stability. We can also see the consequences, certainly maybe more the norm than the exception around the world, of what happens when impediments are placed. The Iranian Revolution, I would argue, was purely an event of mismanaged urban transition. The rise of Hindu nationalist violence in India, authoritarian regimes that have governed against the arrival city in Venezuela, Egypt, many other places, choking off both social mobility and rural development. We have to understand the link between a successful neighborhood and an entire country's fate. The subsistence level rural village is too often fetishized by countries as something that is an unchanging thing that must, in the case of many Indian politics, something that should be preserved and untouched and so on. But the subsistence rural village is the largest killer of humans in the world today, I would argue. According to the World Food Program, 3/4 of the world's billion people living in hunger are peasant farmers, or people who live in peasant farming villages, often landless people within those villages. Mortal poverty is a rural phenomenon. Almost all of those living on purchasing power incomes of less than $1 a day live in rural areas. In the marginal neighborhood in the city, if things go wrong, you may have to send your children to sell individual cigarettes on the street, which is a great humiliation. In the subsistence rural village, if things go wrong, your children die. The dramatic decline in the number of very poor people in the world during the past decade, with 98 million people leaving poverty between 1998 and 2002, and the world poverty rate, absolute poverty rate, falling from 34% in 1999 to 25% in 2009, was caused pretty much entirely by urbanization. Either people made better livings when they moved to the city, or they sent funds back that developed the village and moved it out of poverty. Urban incomes everywhere are higher. There's every index you can think of in terms of longevity, infant mortality, HIV/AIDS susceptibility, death in childbirth, education rates, female empowerment, and so on, improves with urbanization or with urban support for the village. And most importantly, I think, from an ecological and security perspective, is that the shift out of subsistence rural economies will end the greatest problem in human history, which is continuous population growth. There's a direct correlation between urbanization and family size. When people move to cities, their families almost always drop below the 2.1 children per family point at which populations remain stable. They certainly drop far. Even Iran, which went from almost 8 children per family in the 1980s to 1.7 today. It's a good example of a place where neither the religion and culture nor the government in power would seem to be given to great lectures about birth control, maybe some quiet ones, and so on. So we can discount cultural factors, generally speaking, and look at the way to reduce the world population as through making sure that these transitional neighborhoods function as an urbanizing device. And this is a time to be taking this very seriously. According to the United Nations Population Division's middle, somewhat conservative estimate, the world's population will peak at 9 billion in 2050, then start falling worldwide. In a worst case scenario, it will peak a decade later and 1 billion more, or it could be slightly earlier and better. And the difference very much depends on these transitional urban neighborhoods. Most of the problem population growth countries are those with unsustainably large rural populations and lack of transition pathways into the city. There are only about 20 countries in the world driving world population growth today, and they include such well-known places as Afghanistan, Pakistan, Sudan, Ethiopia, places that tend to be conflict places, but also tend to be among the largest importers of food, most of them. A large rural population generally prohibits food production. Canada has 2% of its population in agriculture. It produces and exports more food than it needs by a huge margin, and more than countries with hundreds of millions of people and 75% of their population in agriculture. So we can appreciate the importance of these transitional neighborhoods, but we often ask what can be done to make them work, because so many of them are failures. So many of them have had generations of impediments where, let's look at, the favelas of Rio, where you have to make a deal with a 14-year-old holding a rifle just to walk into them. How do you turn these around? What can be the role of development aid in making these places into engines of social mobility, agricultural development, and social capital? Governments and NGOs have tended to direct their attention to villages in isolation for good reasons. They're easy to unitize and monitor the progress. Their results appear to be more rapid and instantly observable, even if those results have the perverse and damaging effect of keeping people in subsistence farming who maybe should be getting out of it, and keeping populations rural who should be considering building urban links. You still have a measurable, neat unit to control that seems to be away from a lot of the corruption that hits other forms of aid. Part of the problem is that, as well as we've had an earlier history of urban development aid focused on what I'm calling the arrival city that produced a large number of failures. In the 1970s, agencies, including the World Bank, were very heavily focused on slum upgrading projects, and even more ambitious, what they called sites and services projects designed to create better quality landing pads for rural populations who are about to come in. You lay the fresh water and sewage lines and so on in advance on bits of ground on the edge of the city so that it's much cheaper than laying things later. Sounds great, but these projects often failed for a number of reasons, and one of them was the basic real estate economics we should all understand. When you improve a marginal community or a piece of land for a marginal community by adding cement floors or toilets, you're raising its property value to the point that it's no longer a marginal community or something that's affordable to people at the bottom rung of the ladder. People are driven out. It becomes what you might call a middle class community if $5 a day rather than $1 a day is middle class. And we've seen that sort of thing happen over and over. Attempts to redevelop the Kibera slum in Nairobi, which is right beside the UN Habitat headquarters, have failed over and over because the apartments built for rehousing people have been nice enough they've gone to middle-class people instead, or briefly belong to the people in the slum who then sell them to middle-class people and move back into a slum shack. And it's a nice way to give somebody some money. But there is, and I document some of this, an exciting new understanding of the arrival city and its importance in many places, and of ways to turn it around that don't undermine themselves. In Peru, Colombia, and Brazil, cities of those countries, are some very exciting projects that use the rising property values of these improvements to finance the project and to benefit the ex-villagers moving in. These value capture instruments, which resemble a bit the way they redeveloped the Regent Park housing project in Toronto, where you use the appeal of it to the middle class to capture that value for the desired bottom rung people who you want to be benefiting from it. These projects can be almost self-financing in some contexts, but not really. It never quite adds up to that. There are a lot of dreams of development people, of certain schools, who think that simply granting people title to the land under their feet and so on, or creating value capture instruments in redevelopment will cause everything to pay for itself and nice markets to develop. You do need to have inputs from the state and investments from outside agencies and so on in transportation links, infrastructure, education, and so on, or these things won't work. In Brazil, there's an important technique being used for the last couple of years by the national government where multiple interventions at once take place. The neighborhood gets rebuilt with foundations and water, community-based police forces installed, sanitation, and most importantly, street addresses given to people all at once. And street addresses are important because they register who's there so that you don't get people coming in to benefit from this later, but also because you turn people who are informal, marginal people into people who can get real jobs. The street address is often the only difference required, who become taxpayers, who can collect utilities and so on. Now, in Arrival City, I visited a number of places that have successfully turned themselves around, and I would argue that these are not freak exceptions, and I've tried to avoid places that are pet projects of development agencies, but rather places that have simply used internal logic to turn themselves around, from marginal and violent places to places where the transition that began a generation ago but got stalled because of impediments and violence can return itself to its norm and benefit both the families in the arrival city and the villages they're supporting. These are not the easiest fixes in the world. They're not the quickest turnarounds. They're not bed nets or tube wells that produce an instant result. But the outcomes of investments in these transitional neighborhoods spread, as I've said, in multiple directions at once and have important outcomes in the immediate development of both rural and urban places. I would argue that these are the most important outcomes in the world at the moment and are well worth thinking about ways to make them work. Thank you very much.
Comfortable. Couple of questions about what might constitute success and failure in this area. You mention in the book how some of these arrival cities to the visitor look and are terribly poor. And then you cite some studies which demonstrate that through that poverty, in fact, there's ways of assessing whether there's success in that poverty or not. Could you talk a bit about that?
Yes, certainly I'm not trying to glamorize these neighborhoods. I don't think they'd be desirable to, they're not desirable to the people who live in them. And certainly, I've certainly met enough extremely poor farmers in India who avoid sending their sons to go work in, say, Mumbai, because they know they'll have to live in these famous slums with the nasty gangs that control them and the sewage everywhere and so on. And that turns people off, even though the income that you would earn there is 10 times higher than your share of the agricultural income and so on. So the nastiness of these places can be an impediment and so on. But everybody who moves into these places has done so by choice and has often spent a lot of money to do so because it is an improvement over the rural income, even if the lifestyle isn't as nice. People move back when things don't work, and they do sometimes. Those who are staying there because it works. Now, after 2 or 3 generations, yes, you get people who can be trapped. But you don't get many places that are 2 or 3 generations deep anywhere in the developing world right now. Most people you run into, most adults you run into in the slums were born in a village and have made a calculated decision. But there is an economic problem in transitional neighborhoods in places that appear to be poor and getting poorer, often being the most successful neighborhoods. And Actually, the first person I think who noticed that was a guy named Dowell Myers in California, who noticed this with south central Los Angeles. But it's also been observed with neighborhoods in Britain and throughout the developing world, which is that if a neighborhood like this is successful, it's sending a large number of the next generation out of the neighborhood, usually, into better neighborhoods, into education, and so on. And it's taking people in from the originating villages at quite a rate, which means you have this constant group of new people from very marginal backgrounds moving in, which keeps the poverty rate quite low, even if the neighborhood's succeeding. And then governments respond to this observation of poverty in the wrong way. They assume that it's not a transition through poverty to something else, but it's a trap. And if it's a wealthy country, they assume that social workers and family support are needed rather than small business support and technical skills and things like that.
My read of the sort of 24 or more sort of vignettes that you have in the book is that it isn't as if richer countries have got this right and poorer countries haven't. In fact, I'm wearing my IDRC hat, and I think that's not a surprising message, although in some quarters it might be seen as a surprising message. What might be the core constituents, and you referred to some of this in your opening talk, what might be the core constituents of the must-haves in the package of measures that's needed to make arrival cities dynamic and successful as opposed to not?
You mean in the developing world?
In the developing world or in the developed world?
A lot of physical things are required. Transportation is extremely important in a number of ways. And we're not talking about high-speed rail lines or anything, often minibus services. Let's look at the reason why Sao Paulo has been able to turn a good number of its favelas into reasonably stable and peaceful places, whereas Rio, until its recent panic over the horrible violence there, at least, has not. What did Sao Paulo invest in? Because it had about 15 years of fairly enlightened governments that did some things that did turn things around. Minibus services that went into the favelas and brought people out, so that you didn't have this problem that you see in Brazil, but you also see in France, and I would argue in Peel region in Canada, where the places where the village-born migrants arrive are 3 bus transfers and a long walk, and essentially a 2.5-hour trip to the bottom rung job as whatever, a floor cleaner or a garment sewer that you need, and then back again. And effectively, your children are then left with the concrete pad between the apartment buildings or the mud patch between the shacks as their main form of childcare. And we wonder why gangs develop in these places and so on. Basic transportation links are important. A form of security that is not the national police, which is usually a branch of the army, barging in twice a year to conduct raids, is very, very important. And when you ask people in any informal marginal community what their priorities are, they almost always list security as number one. And the idea of community-based policing is almost unheard of out in the eastern or southern quadrants of the world. Sao Paulo developed it in some of its favelas, police forces that were indigenous to the neighborhood, not totally controlled by it, but beat cops essentially, which is such a novel idea. It's completely unheard of, and it was able to have a huge transformative effect in these neighborhoods. Did a better job of getting the drug gangs that controlled them out than having these violent police raids that killed more people than the gangs themselves. Having some kind of education system that doesn't cost a fortune is extremely important, and so on. Now, look, in a lot of places you have a variety of cultural and tribal conflicts and so on going on that are difficult to deal with, that require a higher level solution and so on. So simply saying allowing places to self-govern isn't necessarily the answer. That can mean the dominant faction takes control and so on. But certainly some control from within, or some form of government that has a representation from within as far as how things can develop. None of these transitional neighborhoods are ever going to have any more than a fairly small amount of money to play with in terms of building things. even if aid money comes in. So you need to have some sense from within of what the priorities are. They might not be what people think they'll be. Often a playground for the kids isn't as important as having a truant officer who forces them to go to school. This is often the thing that people will choose instead, and it often has a better result. So a combination of connectedness, security, and semi-autonomy can be the first beginnings to places like that, as well as some physical things that just have to be done. Doing what they call upgrading is very, very expensive, but is worth the investment in ways that often aren't acknowledged through the basic economics used.
That's interesting because, I mean, if I interpret you correctly, finances are important. They might be necessary, but they're not sufficient for success. And there are some instances where huge amounts of finance might not even be necessary. You gave the example of
there could be self-financing things. And I should say, this is not a continuous thing. These neighborhoods do not have to be money sinks permanently. There's a one-time intervention usually needed to make things work. Then again, there are a few areas where there are continuing expenses for the national government if it actually wants things to succeed. There are too many examples, and Brazil's guilty of this, even though it's one of the better examples of building very nice schools in marginal neighborhoods and then putting absolutely nothing into teaching or curriculum or so on, and having, they work well as child care centers, but when somebody's 18, that's not that useful. And we still have very few places in the world where there's free schooling at any age, and almost none where there's all-day schooling. You know.
What do you make of the argument, which I see a lot in North America, and the caricature would go something like this. Cities didn't really exist when the Constitution was written. Therefore, the financial and other sort of fiscal federal processes needed for cities to raise revenues and do all the things they're supposed to were not thought about. And since then, we've been jerry-rigging the governance of cities, and that explains why North American cities often are in trouble. Do you buy that?
It's even a bigger problem in the developing world, right, where independent tax-raising ability is usually non-existent in the cities are simply branches of the national government and recipients of direct block grants from the national government, which often depend on their political relationship and so on. Or, well, in the case of India and a number of other former British colony places, the cities are a horrific patchwork of competing bureaucracies from various branches of government, which are often controlled by different ethno-political clans and so on, whose control over various aspects of city life prevents any development and so on. Certainly, a lot of the reasons why the slums of Mumbai continue to be terrible slums, despite having a huge amount of economic activity within them and so on, is because there seems to be more of a bureaucracy there to prevent them from turning into proper neighborhoods than there is going the other way.
Do you at all think there's a difference between arrival cities that comprise essentially economic and social migrants and those that are the products of conflict?
I've deliberately, look, in arrival city, I've deliberately bracketed out conflict migration and crisis migration from it for a couple of reasons. First of all, because I think there's a public image of immigration in places like Canada based around the refugee and the asylum seeker that's exaggerated. We forget how little conflict migration contributes to immigration in the world now. It's somewhere in the area of 6% of all immigration in the world right now is conflict related, and it's at a lower point now than it probably has been at any point in the last century. This does not discount its significance or its importance or the gravity of the conflicts involved or the dire situations of the refugees produced. It just is not a big part of it, but also because it has a very different dynamic from regular immigration, from the type of investment-based immigration I'm talking about. and often produces a quicker return once the conflict is over because people have not invested in getting themselves a foothold in the city. They are thrust there and forced there without the resources of the village, usually against their will, and so on. So it's a very different thing. Now, some of the same economic things may happen in conflict enclaves if they're there for a long time. And certainly in the West, people who come in through the refugee system often wind up with very similar arrival city dynamics in their neighborhoods as those I'm describing. But it's a separate topic, and it's a separate thing. As I would say is what people are calling climate migration now, which is a real phenomenon, but it is so small compared to the larger migration that will be taking place during the next decades, that even in the worst projections, it'll be a fairly marginal amount, and plus it tends to be combined in with the type of migration I'm talking about. The people from the more marginal communities are the ones most susceptible to climate change, who will be the ones trying to make the largest investments toward urbanizing anyway. So it's very hard to separate those two strands.
Great. So I have one more question, after which we'll turn it over to you. So there's 2 microphones at each end of the room, and don't hesitate to go there to ask your question, and ditto for our viewers on the web. You mentioned this a very striking statistic in China, and as you say, in some other countries, that remittances from cities outweigh farm income. Mm-hmm. And essentially a remittance then is like receiving a welfare payment, not from the government, but from someone from your family. But that must have, and I know you didn't study rural areas as part of the book, but you have.
Yes.
What does that do to the psyche in the rural areas and to sort of incentives to work and live there?
Well, China's a special case because in a lot of cases, what the village is the forced backstop for the social safety net there. You have 200 million people in China, an extraordinary number of people, who are legally villagers but have been living in the city, usually in these marginal self-built neighborhoods, for quite some time, who do not have a rural hukou or household registration, which means that they are legally villagers, cannot change their status even if they live their entire lives in the city, and therefore cannot put their children to school very easily in the city, cannot get unemployment insurance, pensions, and so on in the city, and so on, or a lot of forms of health care. There are some small changes taking place in the legality of that, but the practicality of that is no, you cannot. And it means that you have to keep your parents and your children in the peasant village you came from. Because your parents are going to care for your children and take them to school. You're going to see your children once per year during the Spring Harvest Festival, what we call Chinese New Year. A large percentage of these 200 million people are living like this right now. And it means that the Chinese village is becoming a welfare backstop. It also means that the savings rate of these peasants, legal peasants, actual city workers, is very, very high, because they have to save money in state-owned banks in order to pay for the health care, pensions, education for their children, and so on. And this savings is the main source of capital for Chinese state corporations. So there's a fear in the government that allowing people to follow their instincts and become urbanites fully, sell the farm and allow the peasant farms to consolidate into larger holdings would cause an outrush of capital from the state-owned banks and a collapse of a part of the economy and so on. So you see the larger economics tied into this. Now in other places, remittances don't quite follow that pattern. Bangladesh gets $11 billion a year in remittances, the largest from Britain, also from the Gulf states and so on. That's more money than all development aid to Bangladesh combined. And in some years, it's more money than the revenues from the garment industry and so on. It's a huge amount of money, which is slowly changing. The region's inordinately aimed towards Sylhet, which is the completely rural district up in the upper right-hand corner of Bangladesh, where 90% of the 400,000 Bangladeshis in Britain have all come from. Little regions within countries tend to migrate to countries, not whole countries or anything. So little tiny patches of Poland in the lower left and upper center make up all of the migration to Britain and Ireland. Bihar region in Pakistan, which is thoroughly rural, Kashmiri district, makes up almost all the Pakistani migration except for some Punjabis to Britain and so on. So you often have these rural regions that are hugely overdeveloped. The Rif Valley in Morocco is increasingly like this as well, where you have enormous houses that are financed by the packages of money coming in from the city, palatial enclaves, and when the guy who works in a fish and chips shop in London comes and visits and stays in this house, he's received like a feudal lord and so on. But as people settle in and these relationships become more remote, the money starts to be used more sensibly, often towards either rural development or development of rural non-farm business income sources. And I would say it's quite a beneficial form of development. Canada certainly sends vast amounts to various corners of the developing world this way.
So will fish and chips stores sort of proliferate in Bangladesh the way curry houses? Never mind.
Yeah, exactly.
The floor is open for questions. And as I said, so please identify yourself. Please don't hesitate to ask your question in English or French. Sir.
My name is Farouk Aman. I'm really impressed with the lecture that you have given us. I was just looking at the model of Bangladesh, where we had here 2 months ago, we had Dr. Muhammad Yunus, the Nobel Peace Prize of 2005, and he was not talking about migration. Migration is a big subject and a huge responsibility and challenge for many governments from a budget point of view. Do you think that the concept that he had, where he was encouraging rural people to remain as rural people and encouraging them to work on various sectors of investments, not necessarily farming, but to develop. Do you think that is possible?
Shall we take 2 or 3 questions?
Okay, yes, that's
I don't think I see anyone there, although the lights aren't on. Ben? Okay. Actually, Clyde, you can go here. You can go here. It's okay. Yeah.
Hi there, Rachel Lindsay with the Association of Universities and Colleges of Canada, although my question has nothing to do with education. The concept of climate change was touched on very, very briefly, but one thing that I'm curious to hear is if you've come across in your statistics whether or not more urbanization creates energy efficiencies, or whether these communities are actually more energy intensive. Thanks.
Perhaps if I could deal with those two
sure,
right now,
why
because
not?
In terms of these ideas coming out of Bangladesh, I think there's some beneficial things done. I mean, certainly we know microfinance developed out of Bangladesh, and certain ideas about financing non-agricultural businesses out of small sources of capital and so on. I would say that the reality of that is there is usually an urban connection involved in some way. You certainly wouldn't want to stop that from occurring. Usually the villages, except for the most remote and isolated and hard up ones, and even some of them, are getting some form of support by having someone in the family work in the city. And I mean, this has happened throughout history. And I think often we misunderstand the importance of these investments in villages because we don't see the effects of this. It's often how the loans end up getting repaid and so on. I mean, I know a bit about this way of thinking, and it tends to look at the village as an isolated unit. But I think you'll find that there will be urban inputs, and they ought not to be discouraged. Climate change. Look, let's look at the larger aspect of this question. There are 3 factors to look at in terms of how urbanization relates to climate change. One is the question of whether the individuals who become urbanized are personally producing more carbon outputs. And the answer to that is always yes, certainly, generally speaking. An urban livelihood will give you more money, which will cause you to produce more carbon outputs per person, and so on. The second question is whether cities by themselves are more or less of a problem this way. And then you get some ambiguity because you get economies of scale and shared use of resources, which can lower the problem and so on. Rural areas can often, if the same amount of economic development happens in a rural area, if people are raised to the same income level in a rural area, it'll become much less ecologically sustainable than if people have the same incomes in an urban area, because you have much larger transportation distances, you have heating and so on that can't be shared and so on. But the third factor is the question of population, that even if the individual people are emitting more energy when they become urbanized, the family sizes drop so dramatically and the world population begins to fall that the larger source of the problem becomes much less of a problem. I mean, I pointed out Iran going from 8 children per family during the end of its rural period to 1.7 now. That if you repeat that pattern across the world, which we're in the midst of that downturn happening, then I think you get the much larger answer to the climate problem. So I think in the cosmic sense of things, we should look at urbanization as largely a boon to climate. You may also look at a fourth factor, which is assuming we're going to blow it as far as being able to use policy and agreements to limit carbon emissions politically, the larger cities are going to be more financially and infrastructurally able to build mitigation technologies and so on. Mm-hmm. I think the only cities in the world right now that are physically protected against an ocean level increase are London and Venice. And Singapore is about to spend some vast amount of money in doing this and so on. But hopefully we won't get to the point where that has to be a factor we consider.
Is the point also that when people are closer together, there's more innovation and self-invention going on? Or?
That's certainly where it comes from, yes, where answers will come from. Certainly, there's a lot of talk about urban sprawl. There are some marginal worries about urban encroachment on farmland, although if you look at the map of any country and where the actual high productivity farmland is, it's usually not as big a worry as you think. But the problems of rural sprawl are much, much more significant, which is the problem of large and unsustainably dense populations spread across rural areas that should be producing food and are instead supporting populations. That has ecological consequences that are terrible. In Brazil, when you had a time of smallhold farms spreading across the land, you had a huge encroachment into the rainforest, particularly because families in the developing world since the post-colonial period have tended to go from a system of primogeniture where the oldest son gets the whole land package to one where you divide the land among all the sons, never daughters, which tends to produce, first of all, unsustainably small plots of farmland. Yeah, you can make a good living on 1 hectare and pretty decent productivity. 1/10 of a hectare becomes very, very difficult to create a profit margin that'll sustain itself through a bad year. And in Brazil, they found that this pattern was causing the land to be divided and hacked into the rainforest and so on. So a move to larger scale farming had the ecological benefit of creating a type of farming that first of all, used soil and water table management practices that are easier to do on a very large scale, but also didn't tend to encroach on the forest as much. So.
Thank you very much. My name is Clyde Sanger. It's a fascinating book, and well done. The 2 places that I know that are examples in your book are, I lived in Tower Hamlets for a year in London's East End, and I lived up the Langata Road from Kibera for 5 years.
Oh, yes, very good.
And I have been rounded with the AMREF team, who have sort of adopted one particular village among the 11 villages that make up Kibera. Mm-hmm. this is just a comment, and I have a question on something else. You put a lot of emphasis on transportation. The Bangladeshis and all the preceding immigrants who landed at that part of London's East End were not blessed with very good transportation. Kibera is quite close walk distance from the core city of Nairobi. So, you know, and
They're both places that were blessed from birth with reasonable proximities, it's true, yes.
Well, yeah. The East End is if you've got a bicycle, which I had. But my question is about food shortages. I'm sure you read the article in today's, in your paper today, pleading for higher prices for farmers who are not producing because the prices aren't worth it. But you seem to put the emphasis more on urban agriculture. So
Urban financing of rural agricultural development, anyway.
Well, could you say something about pricing?
Let me just address that right away.
Okay.
Look, I believe that gentleman was arguing more, I hope he was making the case, that the temporary run-up in food prices that's occurred since 2008 will encourage agricultural investment in areas like sub-Saharan Africa and the former Soviet areas in Ukraine and Russia that should be huge bread baskets but aren't, that will then increase world food supply. I certainly hope he's not suggesting that high prices are a universally good thing. Because certainly what we have now is a problem not of pricing but of supply in the world. After a period of maybe 25 years during which the world produced much more food than it needed, and the policies in the West were in how to physically destroy the excesses of food, we've suddenly switched in 2008 to a period when we did, partly because of the use of food for fuel, where we no longer have quite enough food, and that's driving the prices upward, which I think is a temporary problem because we have huge areas of severely underutilized agricultural land around the world. There was a big study run by some African scholars at Harvard that came out in December, which examined African agriculture, and it found that just on the area of rice, it would be fairly easy to develop in sub-Saharan Africa a rice output larger than all of Southeast Asia's. The barriers are very, very small, often, once again, transportation and so on, the ability to get it to market and so on. And some investments of the sort that are occurring right now in sub-Saharan Africa would do that. And I would say that if this temporary, I hope, run-up in food prices causes a desire to invest in a larger scale of farming in many of these places, and is able to increase the world output by even 10% on grain crops, it will be a self-solving problem, and the supply will be enough that prices will fall to a reasonable level. But really, you can make a decent profit as a farmer off the prices we had in 2007. That was not the problem. The problem of agricultural communities having starvation level hunger is not one of commodity prices. It's one of the sustainability of the type of farming they're doing. So I would hope that we can get prices back down again, because we're certainly approaching a world where there are many more food consumers than producers. And while rural incomes are important, I don't think cranking up the food prices to a very high level is the long-term solution to them, because it'll hurt the much larger group of consumers more.
You cite instances in your book of farmland being purchased by urban dwellers and then not being used for farmland. How sort of extensive is that practice, and how much of a risk is it to food production, or how much of a loss is it for food production?
It's less of a problem now than it was in 2007, because suddenly food production is a marginally more interesting endeavor. But more often, I don't think it's a very widespread thing, except on the margins of the city. and so on. And there are big worries about urban encroachment on potential farmland, but I don't think it's a big problem now. There's still so much underutilized decent agricultural land, or land that's subject to enormous wastage between harvest and consumption. I mean, you get up to a third of all grain crops destroyed, sometimes even more than that, because of just absolutely poor warehousing, transportation to market, and so on. But the problems with this that I discussed with the money coming from the city is it's often used for tribute type things, and so on. I think that's bound to be temporary. It's a one-generation phenomenon.
So,
thank you, and thank you, Doug. My name's David Whiteman, and I run an electronic magazine here in Ottawa called X-Ray. And my question is about Canadian foreign policy. Today we had Stephen Harper in Geneva talking about maternal and infant health. And I'm wondering what you would sort of get to suggest, if you had a chance to suggest on a sort of a national forum basis, of what the Canadian government could do to sort of assist in some of the things that you've seen, and some of the policy changes that they could make that would make a difference in these arrival cities that you talk about?
Well, look, I'm not an expert on the fine grain of Canada's development aid policies and the various agencies that deliver them, and I suspect I'm sitting in front of at least a handful of people who actually are. So I'm not going to deign to intervene in the fine details of that. But I would say that there, even in a self-interested policy way, in a realist policy direction, there can be a better return on aid if it breaks away from the very simple things like this. Certainly things like maternal health are worthy causes and well worth investing in, and so on. But we need to move higher up in the causal chain beyond these things. Rather than saying we should be putting bed nets in every village, we should be saying, why are these villages, why are they so poor that they can't even afford a bed net? Rather than simply intervening in maternal health, which I'm not saying we shouldn't in and of itself, we should be asking what are the causal chains behind maternal health being so bad? Why in some African villages are the infant mortality levels so high that 1 child out of 4 dies before reaching 5 years old, and so on? Rather, I think there needs to be the courage in a lot of countries to move from a type of aid that cures the symptoms to a type of aid that works on the disease.
So actually, we do have a question from a colleague at Canada's aid agency, CIDA. She's watching on the web. And Odette Longley asks you, could you please elaborate on the relative importance of access to quality of education, including technical skills training by children and youth for the success of arrival cities?
Well, both quantity of education and quality of education are very, very important. And I think we've seen a lot of countries that have invested in quantity of education, in the building of schools, and there's certainly with a lot of support from Western NGOs and governments, without enough attention to what's actually being taught in them. Half-day schooling remains the norm almost everywhere in the world, and including in places like Germany, where it's still half a day until you're 18 or something. The quality of what's being taught is often very, very poor and doesn't meet the aspirations of the migrant families trying to make it, and so on. Technical skills training is often achieved privately. I've met a surprising number of families who live in favelas and boosties and shanty towns and so on, who've saved impossible sums of money to send their children to private secondary schools. Amounts of money that I would consider would give me second thought in order to do, because it's worth the whatever it is, which might be something like $1,500 a year in a place where your entire family income is $4,000, $5,000, $6,000 a year per child, to do this, because it's worth an incredible investment of a large percentage of your income to have the chance of your child making it in, say, the low end of the IT industry, or anything like that. I've been in enough urban slum houses in the Indian subcontinent where one of the daughters is in the back with a PC that the family has bought for an extraordinary sum of money doing JavaScript programming or something like that at a great educational cost and so on. So there needs to be an understanding that that type of education shouldn't be something that exhausts a third of a family's income and puts them on the brink of starvation to accomplish, and that education is not just babysitting, and it's not just taking care of kids in slums to keep them from shooting each other. It's that too, but that there are these are very aspirational communities in their origin that are seeking a much better quality of education. Yeah, sir.
Hi, Sam Boschra is my name. I just had a quick comment. My understanding of what you're describing as rival cities are basically shanty towns on the urban periphery, if not mistaken.
Or or in the core of the city sometimes as well. Yes.
Okay. I apologize if this is a little long-winded, but some of the assumptions that you've made and some of the comments that you've made, I haven't been to as many countries looking at this situation as you have. You mentioned Egypt. I'm from there, and occasionally when I visit back, I try to figure out what's happening. I'm familiar with this phenomenon around Egypt as well, especially around Cairo.
Yeah, Cairo certainly has the one of the largest accumulations of transitional settlements in the Middle East, and we've seen some interesting activities coming out of them in the last couple of days.
Okay. The comments that I have to make are related to some of the assumptions that you made about these shanty towns or these arrival cities, and also some of the assumptions that you put forward about your view on agricultural work in these areas. The first is many of the people who live in these peripheral shanty towns or arrival cities don't actually remain there for their work. I know, for example, in Cairo, microbuses come and go and basically drop off all of these poor people downtown Cairo, where they basically weave through the streets trying to sell whatever they've managed to get their hands on.
Yeah, when it works well, it works that way. That's right, yes.
So what you effectively have isn't a new community on the periphery, but basically a new peripheral community, poor community competing with the already existing urban poor. In terms of the land reform, sorry, I threw in land reform there. You're mentioning the dichotomy between producing food and supporting populations when you're referring to rural communities. I'm familiar with some of the research, not only from my home country, but in general development research, and that's one of the assumptions that oftentimes is criticized because there doesn't necessarily have to be a dichotomy. And again, going back to my example of Egypt, during the reform, land reform was one of the main things that occurred in Egypt. And many people who were poor before, when they were given a little lot of land, were able not only to produce food to support their families, but also to sell whatever surplus that remained. So again, this dichotomy between production and supporting a population, I have some issues with. And finally, in terms of why output in rural areas that are trying to support populations is lower, I've done a little bit of research on this. My understanding is economic reform and structural adjustment in Egypt is actually what brought in many of these policies that made it less efficient. Farmers were discouraged from producing wheat and encouraged to produce oranges and other things for export markets, which reduced their ability to sustain their own population through agriculture. I think those are enough comments that I'll let you comment on.
Just to take it from last to first, generally a move to export agriculture is a beneficial thing. I think there's a false understanding in many countries that self-provision of food is better than market provision of food, which places rural people at an extraordinary risk by doing that, by increasing the prices. Really what you want is to have the largest supply of food available at the lowest possible price to the largest number of people and so on. And a shift to cash crop export agriculture can produce a cash income that will allow the purchase of lower end grain foods and so on at a much greater volume than you could ever have produced yourself on that holding. And just look, on the first point, the arrival city neighborhood tends to be built around an informal economy. And often the informal buying and selling of things, provision of services at a lower price than so on. And there's always a bit of, in many countries, there's sort of a jealousy and resentment in the established middle class of the big cities of these economic activities going on, which are seen as competition and so on. In Turkey, you could describe the dominant political conflict in Turkey between an old middle class in the center who were built around protected nationalized industries and import substitution industrialization, which eventually teetered over as those economies tend to and failed, and a new lower income but higher trade middle class that developed in the periphery, beginning as informal economies and developing into more or less legitimate industries that competed with them and so on. And much of the political dynamics in Turkey are competitions between this old and new middle class. And in many countries you see this. From what I've seen in the Middle East and North Africa, a lot of the political extremism and Islamism is coming out of, people think it's out of the poor, marginal neighborhoods. In fact, it tends to be out of the children and grandchildren of the people who were part of this state-protected old middle class and so on. Muhammad Atta being an example, a guy whose family was benefited from the old state-protected middle class in the nationalized economy that collapsed and failed in the 1970s and 80s, and became embittered at the competition from the new middle class developing in the margins. This is a dangerous conflict in many places around the world between the peripheral middle class and the old protected middle class, and it is something to be conscious of.
Great. So we have 3 questions, 2 in the room and 1 on the web, and that will sort of take us to 6 o'clock, I'm sure. Ma'am?
Thank you. Kathy Lyon, I'm from CETA. I have a question. When you were, say, in India, in an arrival city in India, we at CETA, of course, we live in a results-based world. Mm-hmm. Did you ever look into the future as you stared literally probably into the melancholy face of utter poverty? What would you have seen in 10 years, in 100 years, and maybe in 1,000 years? And then once you had projected that, what would you have liked to see? Or what would you wish to see in 10 years, and in 100 years, and in 1,000 years? And once you have arrived at that, how did you see the effect on us if what you had wished to see were indeed to happen? Does that make sense?
I'm not capable of projecting that far. I certainly would look at neighborhoods and talk to the people about their ambitions for 5 or 6 years from now, and ask them about what was wrong with that. What I realize is, only through making the mistakes myself, is often a failure of journalists, and I think sometimes government people who go into marginal communities or poor areas, is to make the major question, what's wrong? And we have a long history of asking that, and there are always very clear answers, because there's always a lot of things wrong. And I'm trying to shift it to a question of what is your trajectory and what are the things in the way. So I'd rather ask them, where do you want your children to be 20 years from now? Why have you left the village, and where do you want your family to be 30 years down the road, and so on? I wouldn't even think of 100 or 1,000. And what are the impediments that have been placed in the way of you reaching that goal. Because certainly the people you speak to in these places have very clear ideas themselves of what things should be like 20 years from now, and very specific, carefully calculated and worked out plans to make that happen, and a very, very clear idea of what are the things stopping that from occurring the way they wanted it to.
Perhaps a sort of related question from someone on the web. Essentially, moving involves separating families, and you have lots of sort of anecdotes about that in your book. What is the impact of this separation of families on people and on their aspirations? How often do they go back? How long are they disconnected? And what does that do to their lives?
There are psychological impacts that I think somebody should examine around the world of these extremely isolated families. Particularly, I think there's an image that it's the males of the family who go off to either, to either the big city of your country, or often, let's say, to the Persian Gulf or the West to work and get isolated. But in fact, it's very much feminized, and I would argue that largely always has been. A large amount of the enormous migration into Paris that took place in France in the 18th and 19th century was led by women going to do female-oriented labor in garment industries, in service industries, and so on. And families become very, look, there's an impact on it. There's a great documentary made by a Chinese-Canadian documentary maker who named Fan Li-shin, who in fact helped me out with some translation work in China on this book, called Last Train Home, which is about the effects of this long-term separation of all of the working-age adults in the families in China from their children in the village who are raised by their grandparents, often find that their grandparents are the only close emotional bond they develop, and find that their grandparents are going senile and dying during their vulnerable years of their teens and so on. Multiply this by 200 million, and you have an enormous effect. And China's not the only place with these hollow villages, as they call them, villages with no people between 16 and 55. Romania has enormous numbers of these villages because of the nastiness of Italian immigration rules and treatment of Romanians and so on. So around the world, this is happening. You get a lot of places on the subcontinent where both of the adults in the family, both of the working age adults, are in Dubai or something like that, without citizenship, but making money and sending it all home, and so on. So yeah, there's another book somebody to write on the maybe it makes people stronger, in that old way that the old British attitude that sending kids to boarding school when they're 7 and having them return when they're 18 makes them much stronger and tougher. And but I suspect there are other effects that ought to be considered that may have also been evident in the British case.
Doing weights?
Yeah.
Matt?
I'm Kay Stephenson-Rack, and my question is, could you address the often physical hostility to the arrivals in the arrival city? England shipped off many people to Australia. Brazil has a history of cleaning out slums.
Mm-hmm.
China dislocated many slum dwellers when it built the Olympic stadiums.
Mm-hmm.
The U.S. has a habit of collecting immigrants and illegals and sending them home. Is this a hazard of relocation?
It's the biggest hazard, and that hostility, you could make a map of 20th century history around the political chaos caused by the disruption of the arrival city. There certainly was a period when bulldozing was the norm rather than the exception. It's fairly rare now, to be frank. It makes headlines, and deservedly so, in India and sub-Saharan Africa when it happens. But there was a time when it was on a huge, somebody estimated that a few 100,000 people a year are victims of bulldozing of their neighborhoods nowadays. It was in the millions and millions in the late 70s and so on. It was in India, in many South American countries, in Turkey. And in many of those cases, it was the root cause, the disruption of the arrival city neighborhood was the root cause behind political movements that were threats to the state, uprisings that were threats to the state and so on, when people who probably would have become relatively smoothly integrated parts of the urban economy had their entire generational savings wiped out in an act like this and were forced into marginal politics and so on. This then caused a huge retaliation of military governments, often in the cases of Bangladesh and Brazil and Turkey and a few other places, which caused further disruption and so on, usually at around the same time that the post-colonial protected import substitution industries were collapsing out of their own fiscal self-destruction and so on. And we had a very bad period in many parts of the world in the 1980s and early 1990s, and even continuing later in some places, caused by this combination of disruptions all focused around the arrival city. So yeah, it's not a minor thing. And the fear of the person arriving from outside. And also there's another terrible history of attempting to stop urbanization. In some cases, Brazil tried to hack new cities out of the jungle and the assumption that people would go to a second-rate city that was closer by. Indonesia did, and Vietnam did outrageous things with trying to take people who were hoping to urbanize and shifting them to politically useful places. In all of these cases, and in various African countries, there have been various authoritarian attempts to stop the movement of people. In all of these cases, not only did it do zero, except in ultra-authoritarian cases like Mao's China, not only did it do zero to reduce the number of people moving into the cities, but it meant that the people who were moving in were going in under the radar illegally and were starting off as by definition, a criminal class. From the beginning, because their very presence in the city was criminalized, and so yes, a large part of the history of urban violence and disruption of the last century is because of a misunderstanding or hostility toward the transitional community.
And Doug, if you only have a minute, Amadul Haq, who's been waiting patiently in Spain, wants to know if he should be in bed. Wants to know whether the sort of monopolization of food supply and distribution in the big cities by big corporations is a risk.
Certainly when any channel is reduced to one agent, it's an economic risk. Although it's rarely as monopolized as people think, because you do get these informal channels and so on. But yeah, and look, this is far outside my own area of expertise or specialty or anything like that. But yes, the bottlenecks in the worldwide food system often are in the supply and distribution pathways that lead into the city. And so yes, I understand that is a problem, although it's somewhat aside from the things that I know about.
Right. Well, on that note, thank you. Your book covers a lot of territory that covers almost every element of our lives. There's lots of sort of future research that's pointing here and there, which I suspect you're already following. And I want to thank you for coming to IDRC and for enlightening us on this very important phenomenon. Thank you.
Well, thank you for giving me the opportunity.